Hi folks, SC Closer here. Friends call me Vic. Got another episode of Vic's Sea Stories and Tall Tales. Today I'm going to tell you a boot camp story. We're going to talk a little bit about boot camp. When we arrived at the airport, it was pretty late at night. We arrived at O Hare Airport, and we had to meet up. I don't know exactly how we even remembered how to do that, but somehow we knew, or they got word to us, we had to kind of assemble and meet up. And we ended up going outside of the airport. We were in some area out there, and there were like buses and cabs and all this kind of stuff, and heavy smell of petroleum in the air. Vehicles running everywhere. It was real noisy. And we all had to kind of assemble up out there, and they had somebody, looked like a first class or something, had come to pick us up. And look, they had brought a bus, I think. And anyway, they called roll and made sure we were all there, and we got on the bus, and they drove us on to the base back in North Chicago. That was quite the ride. It was well over an hour. So we get up to the base. Now it's got to be after midnight, and we pull up on Recruit Training Command there in Chicago, or North Chicago, at the base there at Great Lakes, and we're forming up. And then, if you've ever watched the movies, if you ever watched stuff, movies about boot camp and basic training and all that stuff on television, it's just like that. They're screaming at you, they're hollering at you, they're calling you names. There's all kind of stuff like that. And so we're out there and we're forming up, and they kind of get us lined up, and we're trying to march. Of course, we haven't been trained to do this yet. And they're marching us around. I think we went over to 21st Division. I'm not exactly sure. I think that's where they do a lot of the processing and all out. I know they process people in, and I think they process people out over there. So we went over there, and they got us in some barracks, and we had some racks in there. It's an open bay barrack, and we had racks, and there was mattresses and pillows, but there was no bed sheets or pillowcases or blankets or anything like that. There was just mattresses and pillows. That was it. So we got in there, and we started, getting settled in a little bit, and a chief comes around, and we had to empty out all our stuff on the deck, and they had to check us for contraband. And so they were going through all our stuff, and Chief came over there, and he's just using his foot. He's just kicking, my stuff around. And I had a map of Chicago in Illinois, and he was like, "Hey kid, what you doing with the map?" And I said, "I bought that at the airport when we got here," which I did. I think I went in a little shop and bought the map. He goes, "What you need a map for?" I said, "Well, after I graduate boot camp and everything," I said, we might want to go around and see what's going on in the area and everything. He said, "What makes you so sure you're going to graduate boot camp?" And so I didn't really say anything. He goes, "I think you're planning to escape." Now I said, "Escape?" He goes, "Yeah, why else would you need a map?" He said, "You're planning to escape, aren't you, Recruit?" And I was like, "No, Chief, I'm not planning to escape." He's like, "I think that's contraband. I think we're going to have to take that from you." And I said, "Chief, don't take my map." I said, "I'm not planning to escape. What am I going to do?" And he just kind of looked at me, and he's like, "All right, I'm going to let you keep it." He says, "But if you attempt to escape," he says, "I'm going to remember you." And I'm like, "All right." So that was my first little run-in. So anyway, I guess it's probably at this point about 2:30 in the morning, and they're like, "Okay, taps, lights out, get some rest. You got a full day tomorrow." So we lay down. We're trying to sleep, and we may have fallen asleep. I think I fell asleep about 5 o'clock in the morning, just like in the movies. The chief comes back in, and he has a trash can, and he kicks it right down the middle of the barracks. Blam, 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 blam. They start screaming and hollering. There's more than one of them. He had some other people with him. They're just screaming, get up, reveille, get up. Line up, blah, 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 screaming at us and everything. And we're like, we're in a funk because, we didn't hardly get any sleep. And so they line us up and they get us outside and we're forming up outside in the rain and we're getting soaking wet. Now we still have long hair. We're still in the civilian clothes that we've been wearing now for 2 days, going on 3 days. And they're marching us around. And we go over to the chow hall, and we get at the chow hall about 6 o'clock or something like that. We go through and we get something to eat. And they don't give you hardly any time to eat. And then we're out of the chow hall, and then we're running around and we're doing all this processing and stuff. I think I talked about it when I went and they checked my eyes. All that was during this time period. We went and filled out all this paperwork, and we had to fill it all out in triplicate. We're doing all this stuff. We were signing stuff we already signed before we joined. We were just doing all kinds of things, I think we finally went, it's lunchtime, we went and got some lunch. We're still like nasty. They finally take us to the barber shop and get our heads shaved. And I don't know, I think a lot of us felt relieved because I had long hair. All my hair's wet, it's raining and stuff on us. We're getting soaking wet. I wasn't able to wash. I just felt nasty. I felt a lot better when they shaved my head. And then we went over to uniform issue. And we basically just stripped down naked. And then they start issuing you clothes. You can issue your underwear, and they issue you some uniforms and things like that. You start putting some of these things on, and you got some clean clothes that you're wearing and all. And you go through and they start tailoring all your stuff. Now, one set of things you're just wearing them, but and I forgot what it was actually that we probably had that we were wearing. But, they would measure you, and then they would give you the shirts that were your size, and then they would, give you pants that were roughly the right size. They needed to be hemmed. And I think we went out with one pair, and we just turned cuffs up in them, and the rest of them, they marked them to be hemmed, and then later we swapped them off. And, and they gave us our sea bags and everything. Then we had to load everything up, and likely they told us exactly how to do that, and they issued us our shoes and all this kind of junk, full uniforms. They gave us everything. And then it seemed like we marched around and did a few other things, ended up eating chow, and then we went back to the barracks with all this stuff. We were carrying all this junk the whole time. But that was processing. And we processed in. We were so happy when we were finally able to start getting showers and start trying to get into a little bit of a routine. But it was just like the movies. All the screaming and the hollering and the carrying on. I got to tell you, I thought a lot of it was just funny. It really was.